Hey there, welcome to part 4 of the Scrappy Basket series. If you followed along with me thus far, congratulations, you're so close. We're gonna finish our basket today. If you want to dive in, the links to the other videos in the series are in the description below, and you'll find a link to my email update list. You'll get a regular email about basket weaving and access to our free printables library. In the library, I have an instruction sheet on the Scrappy basket, so you can print that out and reference that as you're working. Now the last step is to put the rim on top of the basket. This holds the structure of the basket in place and finishes it off nice and neatly, so you have something that is beautiful. This top edge right now, in my opinion, looks a little bit ugly because you have some raw edges, some folded, crinkled, split edges, and we'll finish it off nicely with some flat oval reed, some seagrass, and lashing. So watch to the end to be able to construct and finish this entire rim, and let's get started. First off, let's measure off a piece of 1/4" flat oval reed, and if you want to use a piece of dyed reed, you can. I'm going to circle this around, and I want it to go around the top of the basket 3 times, and this I will stick in my water bin to start soaking so that when I get to the lashing, it's nice and pliable and won't crack on me. When you're working with dyed reed, because it's gone through either a heat water bath for the dyeing process or soaked in water for a long time, if you used a fiber reactive dye, then the reed has a tendency to be slightly more brittle than normal. And so it can have a tendency to crack on you quite often. So to avoid that, I like to start out by soaking my dyed pieces of reed a little bit longer than I normally would. For the rim of your basket, you'll want a piece of 5/8 inch wide flat oval reed, some seagrass that'll go around the top of your basket, the 1/4" flat oval reed that we talked about earlier for the lashing, and then of course your tools. Now for the rim, we're gonna take one piece of the 5/8 inch wide flat oval reed and circle it right around the top of the basket and cut so that you have 1.5 inch overlap. So I'm gonna cut it right here. Be careful, this flings out. And then, this piece is not going to be long enough. Find a piece that you can use for the inner rim and do the same thing. Circling around the inner rim, and actually I'm going to do this to the outside because that's much easier. And this one I'm just going to overlap 1 inch because the inner rim ends up being smaller anyway. Okay, this reed is very thick, so I'm going to put this in my water bin to soak for about 3 minutes. Similar, I guess, to the dyed reed. To set up these rims, I'm going to take one end of each of these lengths of 5/8 inch flat oval reed and cut off the rounded side. So I'm trimming away that rounded end, one end per piece. And this is about that 1.5 inch overlap section. Just trimming down that. And what this does is the overlap, when these come over top of each other, it takes away some of the bulk so it doesn't stick out quite as much. Now let's tuck this first one into the inner rim, and we're just covering the top row of weaving. So take your trimmed down end and some plastic clamps and clamp this around the inner rim like so. Come on. Ta-da. Here we go. Okay, and then cut away the extra length. So you just have that 1 to 1.5 inch overlap, and then put a clamp over top of that. And now we'll do the same thing to the outside, making sure that the overlaps end up on opposite sides of the basket. So my overlap is here. I'll come and lift up the clamp, and put the end just over top of this top row of weaving. So I'm just covering that top row. I'm going to lift up as I go. Now, there is going to be the location where you have your end tucked behind a row. This is where we're going to go over this top row, and then we need to jump down 1 row so that we're over
just one row of weaving the entire time around. There's just going to be a little bit of a jog where we lower down. So right here, I'm over top this row here, and then on this spoke right here, this is where I'm going to jog down. So I'm over top this row here, and then it jogs down right there, so I end up going in this space. So here, I'm going in this space. Here, I'm going a little bit further than I need to, and then here I'll be back on track. And this ended up being a little bit too long, so I'm gonna trim that down. I like to trim down the corners and make this rounded. You can do that if you want. And then clamp that in place, like so. Now the seagrass tucks in nice and neat into this channel between the two rims to cover up all of our raw edges. And seagrass is another thing that ends up being scrappy in my studio, or having lots of scraps around the studio, so finding small pieces is pretty easy. And then I'll cut the ends so that they butt up, like so. Now we're ready to do the lashing. Tap off your lashing so you don't get the whole room wet. And start, because we're working with flat oval, one side's rounded, one side's flat, start with the rounded side facing up. So you're gonna have a short end that you're working with, rounded side up, flat side against the rim. So it ends up lashing around like so. Now, we're gonna work on a side away from a joint. So I'll come over here and I'm gonna lift away the inner rim so you can see I'm tucking this in between the inner rim and the basket, then looping it up so I create a crease around that inner rim, and then this short end is gonna loop back into the same space and get pulled down into the basket so that I created a loop right here around the rim, just the inner rim. And that is my starting loop or starting knot that I can work from. It holds the lashing in place so that I can pull on it without it coming loose. Now we're going to orient ourselves to the outside of the basket and do the lashing from here. And again, you can lift up your rim to see that you're just on that top row of weaving. Both the inner and the outer rim needs to sit on that top row. So you can adjust things as you go. Don't worry about adjusting it just yet. Each stitch you'll make an adjustment. Now with the rounded side facing up, slide this through your finger. So I always orient my thumb on the rounded side. Slide this all the way through the entire length. And I do this because once I create a space, create the space under that top row of weaving, so my space is right here, I'm gonna send this length through so the rounded side now is facing down and pull through. And if I did not orient it correctly, what happens is it gets twisted here, and then if you try to untwist it, it starts to split the reed and frays and starts to fall apart, and it's a whole thing that you have to deal with. And you don't have to deal with that because you can avoid it. So send it through your fingers. So here, I'm gonna pull nice and tight. The reed shrinks as it dries, so I keep it nice and tight here. I'm gonna pinch this end, orient this again so that the rounded side is facing up, making sure the full length is oriented correctly. Lift up to make sure you're catching that top row of weaving. Create a space between the top row and the row below it. Send your length through, making sure that you maintain that orientation all the way through the length. And now come in and pull nice and tight. So you end up with a nice tight loop like that. Pinch that, bring the reed through, send your reed underneath that top row of weaving and pull through and pull tight. And you can see my rim's starting to form nice and tightly, and sandwich everything together so that my basket won't just spontaneously fall apart. And pull. I'm giving it a pretty good tug. If your reed is damp enough, it's not going to break. I'm not yanking on it or doing anything dramatic. I'm just pulling nice and evenly and hard on the length so that I'm getting a nice tight stitch, and that ensures that as the reed dries, it doesn't loosen and therefore doesn't break. Okay, keep an eye out for that spot where you jumped from one row to the next because of the end just hanging out, that top row of weaving end. And you're just watching to make sure that you jump down in your lashing or jump up in your lashing, depending on where you land on your basket. And when you come to a joint, make sure that your flattened side is underneath and your rounded side is on top. And keep going around. You've probably got this pretty well figured out. If not, I'd watch the video over again from getting your starting knot set up. So now let's jump to the end. And we are almost the end. I'm finishing up doing my last space, putting a stitch in this last space. So I've got a stitch in every space around the basket between spokes. So now I've come back to my starting stitch, and this is personal preference. You can actually end right here if you want, or I like to do one overlapped stitch where I started to ensure that this starting loop stays in place. So I do a stitch to overlap, and I also make sure that that spot is nice and tight on the rim. And then I'll cut my length to about 5 inches, get rid of the extra, and now back into the space between the inner rim and the basket. I'm going to create a space here with my packer so that I can send this end loop around into the space like so. I'll pull it into the basket and then trim my ends inside here like so. And now that is my finished rim. It's a little hairy as in like fibrous. The hairs are sticking off, fibers are sticking off of the reed. So that is how to do basic lashing on a continuous weave basket where you do the jump up or down depending on where your first row of weaving is, and including seagrass, doing lashing with dyed reed. You have now completed your Scrappy basket. Congratulations. This is my completed basket. Your shape may not look entirely the same. I'd love to see your completed Scrappy baskets. Tag me on Instagram at Textile Indie. Thanks again for joining me for this basket series. Until next time, happy weaving. See you later.